Good evening and welcome. My name is Dr. Michael Anderson. I'm the Resource Restoration Manager at the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Office of Spill Prevention and Response. Since the Refugio Beach Oil Spill in May of 2015, I have served as a lead administrative trustee for the Natural Resource Damage Assessment. The Gaviota Coast holds a special place in my life. It's where I learned to surf, scuba dive, and as a UCSB student, launched my career in the marine and environmental sciences. It's a great pleasure for me to now share with you all the work the trustees have accomplished in the planned restoration projects that will compensate for the resource losses caused by the spill. As far as an outline for today's virtual public meeting, I'll provide an overview of the assessment the trustees performed, talk about the natural resource damage assessment process, and then on a resource-by-resource basis, various technical work group leads will discuss the injury assessment and proposed restoration projects for each of the affected resources. We'll follow that with a Q&A or question and answer session and take your questions through chat. And then we'll follow with your comments on the draft plan, which you can also submit through the question box. So first, I'm going to provide an overview of the spill and the assessment that was performed by the trustees. Again, the spill happened the morning of May 19th, 2015, when an underground pipeline, line 901, running parallel to Highway 101, ruptured because of corrosion and released over 123,000 gallons of crude oil, much of which ran down a ravine under the freeway and into the Pacific Ocean. The responsible party is Plains All-American Pipeline LP and Plains Pipeline LP, jointly referred to as Plains. The natural resource trustees overseeing the assessment and having the responsibility for the injured natural resources are the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Office of Spill Prevention and Response, the California Department of Parks and Recreation, California State Lands Commission, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of the Interior, the University of California, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Here's a map of the spill release site, and the red marker here is showing where the spill occurred. And this is a photo of Refugio State Beach in the late afternoon of May 19th, showing the heavy coat of oil that ran miles down the beach following the spill. The spill couldn't have happened in a more ecologically rich and diverse site, the Gaviota Coast, and it included 4 marine protected areas in its path. It was the worst spill in Southern California since the American traders some 25 years earlier, and of course was the same stretch of coastline that was affected by the 1969 Platform A spill. So what happened? Because of the pipeline corrosion problems, the pipeline burst underground with oil pooling on the surface. It flowed below the highway, under the railroad tracks, and through a stormwater channel, and poured down the sea cliff into the intertidal zone where it mixed with the ocean waves and moved predominantly down coast. Some of the oil was also pushed offshore by the prevailing winds that evening out into the Santa Barbara Channel. Again, the spill was characterized by a rapid release of line 901 oil into the intertidal zone at the water surface. It was chemically distinguishable by forensic analysis from naturally occurring tar balls and acutely toxic. The sheen from the spill covered a large area of the Santa Barbara Channel. And we know that the oil traveled from the release area all the way down to Orange County. As the plume of oil mixed with the water column and moved down coast, it killed animals in the water column as well as vegetation. The evidence we saw includes all the dead animals washing up on the beach, the dead seagrasses and algae we observed, and those seagrasses and algae provide important habitat for the intertidal and subtidal animals that we looked at in this assessment. And I'll be talking more about that in a moment. So what are the components of an injury assessment that the trustees must follow? First, the law directs us to establish causality by linking how the release, the pathway extent, and the exposure leads to injury of natural resources. The trustees have the burden of the burden of truth to prove their claim, and as such, this process can take several years of data collection and studies to substantiate injury, such as the death of organisms to subtle subchronic adverse effects. The trustees also estimate how long it will take for a given resource to recover from the injury. And over the next few slides, I'm going to give you a brief overview of all the scientific studies we did to quantify injury. I've already discussed the release, but how did the trustees assess the size or footprint of the spill? First, we used forensic evaluations of oil, water, and tissues to establish what was exposed to Line 901 oil versus what was seep oil that naturally occurs in the area. I'm sure you're all aware that the Coal Oil Point seep field is one of the largest natural oil seeps in the world, and we had to be able to differentiate that seep oil from the toxic Line 901 oil that was spilled. So that took extensive chemical analysis. These brown dots here on the map represent the natural oil seeps that occur in the area of the spill. The next thing we did to look at the pathway and extent of the spill was to do trajectory modeling. In this case, we used the NOAA model, or the General Operational Modeling Environment Surface Trajectory Model. And this model uses regionally measured ocean currents and winds to help us understand the potential footprint of the spill and the likelihood that Line 901 oil reached the various shoreline locations far down coast from the spill area. The model has limitations. For example, the simulation requires that the oil be released 1 kilometer offshore from the sea cliff release area because there are no nearshore transport factors available. So the model was mainly used for understanding where the oil could have moved after it made it into the Santa Barbara Channel. Also in the model, the movement of oil is simulated by particles, and these particles don't necessarily represent the actual mass or volume of oil that reached the various shoreline locations. It's just going to show you the probable locations that oil may have stranded along the shoreline, not necessarily how much oil. So here's the simulation. You can see the oil moving offshore into the Santa Barbara Channel on May 19th and 20th. From May 20th to 23rd, strong winds and currents pushed the oil southwest down the Santa Barbara Channel. And you can see that the oil did not directly impact the Channel Islands, which we confirmed again with chemical forensic samples. By May 24th, the oil hits the Ventura County coastline, and then several days later, it makes it all the way down to Los Angeles County, in what was termed as the South Bay incident at that time. That oil was forensically matched to Line 901. And you can see it just hit the Manhattan Beach area right now. Okay, finally we used what's termed SCAT, or Shoreline Cleanup and Assessment data, that are collected by the oil spill response teams, as shown in the figure below. You can see there are different colors along the shoreline indicating various levels of oiling, with red being the highest level of oiling, orange moderate, yellow light, green very light, and blue no observed oil. The gray-green color here along the LA County area represents sporadic to very light to moderate tar balls on the beach. And I'll be talking more about these exposure zones, A, B, C, and D, later in a moment. Also wanted to mention that LIDAR and coastal imagery was also very important to understand the various sizes of the shoreline and subtidal habitats in the pathway of the oil. LIDAR involves measuring very subtle changes in elevation with laser-based imagery, and that was useful to help define different types of habitats, such as the amount of rocky reef or kelp habitat, as well as the width and length of sandy beach habitats impacted by the spill. Next, the trustees looked at the exposure and subsequent injuries from the spill. First, I'm going to briefly talk about some of the subtidal and fish habitat studies we did to assess exposure and levels of injury. Of course, I've already previously mentioned that we observed a lot of mortality of organisms following the spill, and you can see in this picture on the left whole dead intact lobsters, squid, and other animals. In the picture below, you can see a bleached or dying egregia or feather boa kelp. And similarly, you can see the dying leaves of surf grass in the picture on the bottom right. The trustees did a variety of studies. Dr. Dave Whitting will talk more about that in a moment. The studies were performed, included extensive water chemistry analysis of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, which are the toxic component of oil, a 3-species toxicity bioassay, a tissue chemistry analysis, a surf grass health assessment, a surf perch analysis of biometabolites of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, a grunion spawning and hatching study, and an assessment of sheening and kelp canopies within the spill area. Next, shoreline habitats. Again, the shoreline oiling levels were collected by the spill responders, and those levels were very important to us. The mortality observations, of course, the three species bioassay, the chemical analysis of pore water that Bruce Jobe will be talking about in a moment when he talks about the shoreline injury and restoration. And it's also we had the support of academic researchers for sandy beach invertebrate population studies, which were performed by Dr. Jennifer Dugan of UCSB, and rocky intertidal assessment surveys that were performed by Dr. Pete Ramundi of UC Santa Cruz. We also quantified the impact of spill cleanup operations on the various shoreline habitats we assessed. For birds and marine mammals, we did wildlife reconnaissance with air and boat surveys. We collected live and dead bird and mammal intake data from the oil spill response. We studied snowy plover colony oiling and effects on reproduction in plovers. We did a brown pelican roost surveys and rehabilitation survival studies after they'd been cleaned of oil. We looked at a sandpiper pier cormorant colony to look at any impacts to that colony. And finally, we took evaluated a lot of marine mammal stranding observations before and after the spill to help us understand the impacts on marine mammals. As far as exposure and injury in the context of human uses, we studied lost recreational uses as well as lost university research, education, and outreach. We did targeted user counts and user surveys. We compiled available use data. We interviewed land managers from Santa Barbara to Los Angeles, and we performed statistical analysis of user trends and economic modeling of travel costs to determine the value of the various trips or activities that were affected by the spill. Now, finally, in conclusion, this is a map of the various exposure zones and the spill-affected habitats and resources that we developed for the spill. You can see that Zone B is as being the highest shoreline impact area, and this is also where we did our subtidal and fish injury assessment. Zone A to the west and Zone C to the east were moderately impacted areas. And then Zone D, farther to the south, Ventura and Los Angeles counties, either had very low or no exposure to Line 901 oil. And these red dots along the coastline, again, represent oil or tar balls or tar patties that were forensically matched to Line 901 oil. Now I want to move into a little bit about the natural resource damage assessment process and how it applied to this spill. When the potential components of an oil spill case settlement include outstanding cleanup costs, these are the spill response costs, the fines and penalties, injunctive relief for the necessary changes in pipeline operations to prevent another spill in the future. And then there's other claims, such as public entities and cities and counties that have lost revenue, lost parking fees, or extra staff time to respond to the spill. And then there are private claims, such as lost income or injury to property caused by the spill. But what we're focused on is natural resource damages. The outstanding cleanup costs, the penalty amounts, the injunctive relief are all matters of the U.S. DOJ consent decree, and comments on those are under a separate comment period from March 20th from March 20th to May 20th. The NRDA comment period started April 22nd and will be completed June 8th. Now a little bit about the legal authority for pursuing natural resource damages. It includes a variety of laws. Probably the most important are the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, some other federal laws, And then the most important state law is the Lempert-Keene Sea Strand Oil Spill Act for California. And then there's also other applicable state laws. As far as coordination during the spill, we certainly coordinated with Plains, the responsible party, several cities and counties, Goleta, Santa Barbara, Los Angeles, Ventura, several bands of the Chumash Nation, NGOs, and local and national experts. Now, as far as the steps in the Refugio NRDA, first there was a spill on May 19th, and the NRDA team started collecting data on that day. Second, the data collection process now has been completed. Similarly, the injury and damage quantification is complete. We had a public scoping meeting back in January of 2016 in Santa Barbara to solicit restoration ideas from the public. Then we issued a notice of intent to inform the public that we were planning to perform natural resource damage assessment and restoration planning, which was published by the trustees in March of 2019. A draft restoration plan has been completed, and a public comment period has been open, and that's where we are today. And then after that, after this comment period ends on June 8th, we estimate that the final restoration plan will be published sometime in late summer of 2020. And then finally, we anticipate that we'll begin implementing restoration projects in 2021 and onward. The whole goal of this process is to ensure that the restoration projects appropriately compensate for the spill losses. Just want to go back to injury and damage quantification and give you an example. For wildlife and habitat, all the methods are restoration-based. The key questions are how big of a restoration project is needed to compensate for the injury, and how much will that project cost. One of the economic methods we use is called resource or habitat equivalency analysis. It's discussed in much more depth in the restoration plan, but I'll give you a brief overview of that now. So HEA, or habitat equivalency analysis, is a method used to scale restoration to injury. So you can imagine that there is a habitat, and that habitat has an initial value over time. Now, after the spill happens, there's a dramatic decrease in the value of that habitat, and then over time, the value of the habitat increases as there is recovery. We refer to that habitat condition as baseline, or conditions but for the spill. Now, this area of the red triangle is injury. The recovery from injury to baseline can be made to go quicker if we conduct primary restoration, and in this case, for the Refugio spill, cleanup crews removed the oil from the beaches and waters to try to limit the further impacts of the spill and reduce the level of exposure to oil. But the main goal of the equivalency analysis is to match the restoration project benefits in a manner that compensates for that red triangle, or the injuries caused by the spill. So in terms of habitat, we want to balance the acres lost over time from the spill to be equal to the acres gained over time from a given restoration project. Just want to talk about how do the trustees go about finding a restoration project that has benefits which compensate for those spill impacts. The trustees have multiple screening criteria that are further discussed in the damage assessment and restoration plan. I don't have time to explain each criterion in detail. However, it's important that the project has a direct linkage or nexus to the injured resource. For example, since pelicans were killed or injured by the spill, the trustees should implement a project that benefits pelicans. Other criteria are things like compliance with applicable laws, the project provides multiple resource benefits, the time to and duration of the benefits are considered, avoidance of adverse impacts by the project has a high likelihood of success, the project's cost effective, it's technically feasible, it's not duplicate or replacement funding, It provides cultural or historic value, educational research value. There's no adverse effect of the project on public health and safety, and there's opportunities for collaboration, ways to leverage other funding sources. So here's a summary of the various affected resources and damages settlement amounts for each resource category. For birds, $2.2 million. For marine mammals, $2.3 million. For subtidal and fish habitats, $6.1 million. For shoreline habitats, $5.5 million. For human uses, $3.9 million. Then the trustees also have a category for restoration planning, implementation, and oversight. That's so we can monitor and get all the projects off and running and monitor their success. And that's $2 million for a grand total settlement of $22 million. So this concludes my presentation, and now I'd like to introduce our next speakers related to birds, marine mammals, subtidal and fish habitats, shoreline habitats, and human uses. First, Jenny Merrick will be speaking to us about birds.
All right, thank you, Mike. As Mike said, I'm Jenny Merrick with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We have a field office in Ventura, California, and at the time of the spill, we had approximately 18 biologists that were trained in spill response in NRDA as a collateral duty. So we were happy to be able to mobilize quickly and participate in this multi-agency effort. So for the bird injury assessment, we analyzed impacts into 3 categories. We looked at brown pelicans, western snowy plovers, and all other birds. And so I'm going to walk you through the kind of science and analyses we did for each of these categories and present the restoration that we're proposing. So first, we assessed injury to brown pelicans. 73 were captured live or collected dead during the spill. We know more birds were affected than were identified through these efforts. So the goal of our studies was to figure out how many more were injured but were never captured or collected. First, we know that brown pelicans were nesting at the time the spill occurred, and the only place in the western U.S. that pelicans successfully nest is on the Channel Islands. We worked with the Channel Islands National Park to conduct surveys of breeding sites out there and did not observe any indications that the spill affected breeding birds. So knowing that, we focused our efforts along the mainland roost sites where pelicans congregate. We conducted surveys to count how many birds were in these locations and to document what percentage of those were oiled. And we know from our past experience and from literature that an oiled bird is most likely a dead bird because the oil compromises the bird's ability to stay warm and dry. So these data gave us information to estimate the number of birds that were impacted by the spill, but that were missed by the efforts to capture and rehabilitate them. We also looked at the rehabilitation success of these birds, and we provided an estimate of a rehabilitation credit. All those data combined, we estimate a total of 319 brown pelicans were injured by the spill. So although the injury to pelicans occurred along the mainland, one place that we can have a lot of benefits to pelicans by one project is by enhancing their breeding habitat on the Channel Islands. So Anacapa Island supports the largest breeding population of all the islands, and there's an invasive plant, Cape Ivy, that's growing in one of these canyons, and we want to remove it now before it can spread further and really degrade the quality of that breeding habitat for brown pelicans. Moving on to western snowy plovers, the dedicated folks at Coal Oil Point UC Reserve were preparing for the oil even before it made it to their shores. Western snowy plovers were nesting during the time of the spill, and they just create their nests right on the beach and forage for amphipods within the kelp rack and in the swash zone. And so there's a big risk that plovers could be injured by the oil itself or by cleanup activities. After very close monitoring and coordination with the cleanup crews to minimize impacts to plovers, we did not identify any mortality of western snowy plovers during the 2015 season when the spill and cleanup occurred. However, the year after the spill, a spike in infertile eggs was documented at Coal Oil Point. We believe this spike is related to adult birds preening and ingesting oil during the spill, causing a reproductive injury that manifests the following year. Plovers also nest at several locations in Ventura County, which all received some lighter oiling and were subject to cleanup activities. We determined that these effects to plovers in the Ventura County beaches would be through disturbance by response workers or reduction of their prey. And these effects are quantified through the shoreline assessment that you'll hear about soon. Many of the proposed restoration projects for the shoreline section will also provide benefits to western snowy plovers. The proposed restoration project specifically for plovers is to conduct management to protect the population at Coal Oil Point Reserve. So in addition to brown pelicans and western snowy plovers, there were over 25 other species of bird affected by the spill. 193 were captured live or collected dead during the spill response. So to understand the number of birds missed by the spill response, first we looked at beachcombers data, and that's a program that involves highly trained citizen scientists who go out and walk the same stretch of beach one time every month at the beginning of the month, and they document how many mammals and birds are on that beach. And we use that data to understand roughly how many birds we would expect to see on a beach if it were not for the spill. So that's how we established our baseline. Then to estimate how many birds were affected by the spill, and also the number missed by the response, we ran a beached bird model. And that model considers the number and location of birds that were collected by the response, along with how well we searched and looked for them. So we looked at how many beaches were searched and how well they were searched. And the model uses all that data, and we came up with a total estimate of 235 other birds that were injured by the spill, not including brown pelicans and plovers. So in order to think about what we could do to have beneficial effects to that broad list of bird species that were injured by the spill, we took a look at intake records for bird rehabilitation centers along the California coast. We found that the primary human-caused reason that birds were needing rehabilitation was from fishing hook and line injuries. So we're proposing to work at recreational fishing locations to reduce impacts to birds, and it could include things like improving fish cleaning stations to ensure that fish oil and waste doesn't harm birds, or providing educational materials and supplies to help recreational fishers avoid entangling birds. And if a bird does get entangled, we want to provide resources so that folks know who to call to get that animal help. So in summary, these are the 3 restoration projects we're proposing for birds, and we would love your feedback today or at any time during the public comment period. And now I'll hand it over to Lori Sullivan with NOAA to present on marine mammals.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Lori Sullivan. I'm an environmental scientist with National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And I'm going to summarize our marine mammal assessment and tell you about our proposed restoration project as part of the NRDA. So our assessment initially focused on what species were likely to be exposed during the spill during the response period, that is when the Coast Guard and everyone was doing cleanup. So this was done through aerial surveys conducted by the Incident Command, as well as by NRDA-sponsored surveys and information from marine mammal strandings. So, for example, in the aerial surveys done by the response, they didn't see any sea otters in the areas affected by the spill, so our NRDA assessment did not continue with any sea otter NRDA assessment. However, other species seen during this time included whales, dolphins, and pinnipeds. So next, in order to estimate and quantify the injury for the NRDA, we determined injury kind of as evidenced by increased strandings of marine mammals in the 6 weeks or so after the spill. And then selected restoration for injured species as well as where other exposed species could benefit. So I'm next going to describe a little of the data we used. So I talked a little bit about the aerial surveys done during the response, but the NRDA also undertook some shore-based observations starting a few days after the spill, and boat-based surveys along the Gaviota coast. The boat-based went from June 2nd to June 7th. And these would be primarily to document the presence of whales, dolphins, and pinnipeds in the area exposed by the oil. The pinnipeds, that is harbor seals, elephant seals, and California sea lions, are of course well known in the area. So during these surveys, we did find long-beaked common dolphins, bottlenose dolphins, gray whales, humpback whales, harbor seals, and California sea lions. The map shown on the slide is just from one of the days of the survey along the Gaviota coast. It's the boat track, and the other days are shown kind of we have that in the damage assessment and restoration plan. So we would suggest from this that all these species were likely exposed to Line 901 oil. So the way we estimated and quantified the injury was based on marine mammal strandings collected through July 7th in Santa Barbara and Ventura County. The sources of these data first are the Wildlife Branch of the Oil Spill Response, led by the World Wildlife Care Network, responded to approximately 164 stranded marine mammals during the spill, 62 of them live, the rest dead. The stranded animals were mostly California sea lions, but also included long-beaked common dolphins, harbor seals, northern elephant seals, and a bottlenose dolphin. Please note the live oiled marine mammals were all pinnipeds, were taken to rehab facilities to be cleaned, rehabbed, and, if possible, released back to the ocean. So as part of our assessment, we included all those animals that were done for the response, but we also counted animals that had stranded up to about 2 weeks after the response ended. So for our NRDA, our quantification tabulated the total number of strandings encountered in Santa Barbara and Ventura County, but we took into account what would be expected if there were no spill. That's as Jenny, I think, had described, or Mike, as baseline. For example, for California sea lions, under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, NOAA had declared an unusual mortality event, which actually started back in 2013, meaning that there were high strandings even without the spill, especially for the pups. And that UME went from 2013 to 17. So we take into account that kind of thing in our analysis. We also take into account animals that we didn't see, that have died at sea and lost due to scavenging, drift, or sinking by applying a lost at sea factor. So on one hand, we're subtracting out animals, and the other, we're applying a multiplier. So the lost at sea factor was derived from the scientific literature. Okay, the final injury numbers were 76 cetaceans, all dolphins, and 156 pinnipeds. Again, all of these were from the strandings. And again, taking into account the lost at sea factor plus baseline, plus animals that may have died before the spill and were still on the beach. So if they were really decomposed, they would not have counted as animals related to the spill. So our restoration focused on projects that could benefit pinnipeds and cetaceans. I, of course, dropped. So there's two projects that we're proposing. First is to improve pinniped rehabilitation. These are to improve rehab facilities and capacities in order to be able to respond to more live stranded animals in the area and increase the number of animals treated. So that would ultimately improve survivorship for animals in distress. So this would primarily benefit pinnipeds that are the ones that usually strand live. The second project is to enhance cetacean entanglement response. There's existing groups or programs that respond to cetaceans entangled in gear and other, fishing gear and other lines, and this is to enhance that by providing staging areas, boat time, and training and other gear in order to enhance the capability. This should be able to increase the number of animals responded to, leading to more disentanglements and improving survival. But it also provides valuable reporting to help in future management actions as manage the recovery of species. So those are our two proposals, and we're moving on to subtidal and fish with Dr. Dave Whitting. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Steve, and thanks, Lori. My name is Dr. Dave Whitting. I work for the Mineral Restoration Center. I'm a biologist located in, I'm a fish biologist located in Long Beach, California, and I've been involved in the case from the very beginning as the lead for the technical working group for subtidal and fish habitats. Today I'm going to provide an overview of the injury to the subtidal habitats, and they're a little bit different than the previous two resources, so I'm going to go into a little detail. Some of it will be review from what Mike described, but I'll be going into a little bit more detail on some of the aspects of it. I'll provide a summary for the injury assessment and a description of our proposed restoration projects. The subtidal injury is complex, and I'm going to run through this animated story basically to run through how the oil affected or could affect the subtidal environment. And so that sort of sets up the approach we took to the damage assessment and the restoration. So as Mike said, the oil ran from the land through the surf into the coastal ocean. And if the ocean was a perfectly static, calm place, the only resources that really would be affected would be those that interact directly with the surface, like birds and marine mammals, which we talked about already. However, we know that the ocean is not a static, calm place all the time. And in fact, there's quite a lot of movement that complicates the injury to the subtidal. The oil, as it enters the surf, is mixed by the surf activity and actually doesn't take much of a wave. A small wave can still create a sort of blender effect, mixing the oil in the water column. That mixed oil is transported offshore and alongshore by currents and surge. In addition to that, the oil sheen that's at the surface, beyond the surf zone, is also mixed into the subtidal zone by small waves or even larger waves and wind-driven mixing. This results in a mixture of the oil throughout the water column, represented by all these red dots, where they have microparticles of the oil throughout that near-shore water column. This kind of toxic effects on the fish and invertebrate life on the bottom. As you can see, the fish are dying and lying on the bottom. Some of the fish are then also are washed ashore and up on the beach. Whether they go on the beach or die on the bottom of the ocean, they're often scavenged by various scavengers. And what this does is effectively transfers that oil that's on the dead organisms up through the food chain and the food web. If you look a little closer at the effects of the oil, there are some smaller, less easily visible effects. For example, the early life history stages of fish that are in the water column in that coastal ocean area are very sensitive to the toxicity of oil, and they can become deformed and ultimately die as a result of exposure to these microparticles of oil. In addition, the plant and algae species that make up a big part of the habitat in the coastal ocean, their leaves become coated with oil, and in fact, that oil will have an effect on the cell, killing the plants and the algae, and basically effectively losing that habitat component. In addition to that coating of oil on the leaves will negatively affect the broad diversity of organisms that use the kelp and the other habitat-forming plants as habitat themselves, and a lot of that community is lost when those leaves become coated with oil. In addition, oil that reaches the bottom will affect the rhizomes or the root structures of the plants and the algae, further causing mortality of those critical habitat-forming plants and algae. In addition, if you look over on the left, one of the functions of kelp in the coastal marine environment is that it loses leaves on a regular basis. Those leaves float to the bottom and they become food for grazers that are living on the bottom. And this is a way of transporting that oil from the surface to the bottom and into the food chain, negatively affecting that coastal food chain. So if you take this all together, we wanted to address this as a habitat injury and try to look at the damage or the injury to this coastal marine habitat, looking at these various endpoints. So looking at mortality of organisms, looking at loss of habitat-forming vegetation, and also looking at the effects of the oil making its way through the food web. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is our exposure studies. These were really documented by documenting oil on or in organisms. So on the left, we have oiling on the leaves of surfgrass. We have oiling on dead lobsters and other marine organisms. But we also looked at the oil making its way through the food chain by looking at the metabolites of oil in the bile of surf perch, which is a common resident subtidal fish in the area that was present during the spill. We also wanted to use a measure of quantifying, what proportion of the habitat is lost or affected by the oil. The approach we took to this was using the surfgrass habitat. This habitat was very clearly affected. It was obvious because the leaves of oiled surfgrass plants became yellow. And this is because the cell, if you look on the left, the cell of oiled plants, the wall breaks down and it loses the chlorophyll. So the compound that makes the leaves green are lost. And you can see the difference between oiled leaves and control leaves on the right here, where the control leaves are bright green and the oiled leaves are yellow. And then the lower panel on the right, going into the subtidal surfgrass habitat, you see these waves of yellow and green oil. And by quantifying the percent of the total area that has this oiling, we could calculate a percent injury or percent loss of that habitat. We also looked at mortality of early life stages. We used grunion as our model organism on this. Grunion spawn in the sand during high tides. They were spawning during the oil spill, laying their eggs in the oiled sand. The eggs were exposed to the oil. And then we looked at hatching and survival rates of those eggs to look at whether the oil affected their survival and also the level of deformations of those larvae. In addition, we wanted to look at the mortality of adult or larger organisms. So we kept an inventory of all the oiled and dead fish and invertebrates we found on the beach, and there was really an unusually large number, both in the sense that it was a large number for any random day. You don't see that many dead animals on the beach typically, but also unusual for an oil spill in general. And this really speaks to the fact that this spill was unique in the sense that the oil ran from the shore into the beach, was mixed by the waves, made its way through the water column, and really caused significant mortality of those subtidal organisms. So in summary, we estimated about 2,200 acres of benthic subtidal and fish habitat were impacted. We documented this based on the unusually high number of oiled and dead carcasses of a variety of species observed on the beach. We observed that grunion larvae that were collected from oil-exposed beaches had higher rates of mortality than those from unoiled beaches, and that surfgrass discoloration and leaf die-off from cell die-off and loss of chlorophyll was observed within the oiled area and was not observed outside of the oiled area. And also the surf water samples were analyzed for chemical compounds, and they were found to exceed adverse toxicity levels. Now, moving on to restoration, we have 4 categories of restoration projects. The first of those is an abalone restoration project. Abalone are a iconic species for Southern California. They've been important culturally and economically in California, dating back at least 12,000 years. They're also an important member of the kelp forest community in terms of their role as a grazer in that kelp forest habitat. So A kelp forest with a healthy abalone population is a healthier kelp forest. Abalone, as many of you may know, have been depleted significantly to the point where 2 species on the are federally endangered, and several others are on species of concern. And all of the abalone in Southern Southern California are significantly depleted. The project is aimed at restoring abalone populations to roughly 10 acres of rocky reef habitat off the coast of Santa Barbara. The second habitat category is eelgrass restoration. Eelgrass beds are an important habitat for a variety of fish and vertebrates, and the project aims to restore eelgrass in areas where it once occurred but has died back for one reason or another. The third category is really centered around kelp restoration. The trustees are still investigating the best mechanism for doing kelp restoration in the Santa Barbara area. One of the options is an existing project where a group is attempting to restore kelp in a sand bottom habitat where kelp once flourished and no longer does, by using concrete posts that they use to start the kelp growth on. The trustees aren't currently proposing to expand that project, but rather implement a comprehensive monitoring effort on that project to determine whether or not it's a viable project for additional restoration work. And then finally, there's a Ellwood seawall removal project. This is a derelict seawall that is causing various problems for the shoreline and the subtidal. It's a large project, will have great benefits to both the shoreline, which Bruce will talk about in the next group, but also benefits to the subtidal. And this project will largely revolve around extending the monitoring for the project into the subtidal to document the value of removing the seawall. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton off to Bruce Jobe, who's going to talk about shoreline projects. And thank you for your attention.
Good evening. My name is Bruce Jobe. I'm a senior environmental scientist, and I'm with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Office of Spill Prevention and Response. And today I'm here to present information to you on the shoreline habitat injury and the compensatory restoration projects that we are proposing to do for that injury in this draft damage assessment and restoration plan, or draft DARP. Now, this work was performed by a team of scientists from multiple trustee agencies. Here's a little outline. So basically, I will be covering a very brief overview of the exposure and injury to the shoreline habitats that resulted from the oil spill. Then next, I will discuss the 4 compensatory restoration projects that we, the trustees, are proposing in the draft DARP to compensate for those injuries. So injury assessment. For shoreline, the injury assessment was done in 2 basic parts: exposure evaluation and then injury evaluation. To document the exposure, the trustees conducted a number of different studies. We collected photographic evidence and compiled observations of shoreline oiling that was collected by the shoreline cleanup and assessment teams that were mentioned earlier. They're also known as SCAT teams. We determined the number of acres of exposed shoreline by analyzing the SCAT results combined with tide and topographic data, including the LIDAR information that Mike described earlier. We worked this up to 1,488 acres of oil-exposed shoreline. And here notice the picture of the oiled shoreline with the person pointing to the oil. In addition, we conducted specialized surveys to document exposure of rocky intertidal habitats. And for that, notice the upper left photo of the oil barnacles in rocky habitat. We also analyzed the various surf water and pore water samples. Now, pore water is the water found in the interstitial spaces between sand grains on a beach. It pools up when you dig into the sand, as shown in the photograph in the upper right portion of the slide. Notice also the oil sheen that is visible on the water surface there. So the trustees conducted forensic chemistry analyses of the shoreline oil samples that we collected to distinguish Plains' oil from the seep field oil. And finally, we collected various invertebrates listed here and analyzed tissue samples to document that exposure. Notice the lower left is a photo of sand crabs in and near the oil. Injury evaluation. So to evaluate the injury itself, the trustees conducted both field and laboratory studies. We took into account the life histories of the affected organisms. Now, some of those injuries were observed directly in the field. For example, the dead organisms that you've already seen several photographs of, and also recall the sand crab stuck in the oil in my previous slide. Rocky intertidal surveys were also conducted to look at species composition changes, and we conducted population studies of beach hoppers, and notice the dramatic decline in zone B shown in the graphic in the lower right portion of the slide. We compared concentrations of oil constituents in our chemistry samples to toxicity thresholds in the scientific literature. And for that, notice the sand crabs that were collected for that tissue analysis, shown here in the bottom left portion of the slide. We also conducted laboratory toxicity tests using early life stages of sand crabs and 2 other species. Notice the right photo of sand crabs from that study. So our proposed restoration projects. Here are the 4 restoration projects that we're proposing in this draft ARB. The Ellwood Seawall Removal Project, which has already been mentioned. The Black Abalone Restoration and Relocation Project. Ventura County Dunes Restoration. And a Santa Monica Bay Beach and Dune Restoration Project. So the Ellwood Seawall Removal. This wall is a remnant of oil and gas operations that took place during the mid to early 20th century. It is approximately 1 mile in length in various conditions along its length. And actually, its intended purpose when it was built wasn't as a seawall, but rather as a support for a road to access the oil production field. Removal of this wall will allow the beach to widen, benefiting the beach ecosystems as a whole. It will allow the restoration of the upper beach zones, which currently are absent at this armored portion of the coastline. The stranded kelp, known as wrack, will again be able to deposit on this beach with that widening, which will lead to an increase in invertebrate abundance and diversity. Grunion, which were mentioned earlier and which spawn in the sand, will benefit, and the bird abundance and diversity will also increase. Additionally, the creosote timber pieces will be removed from this system, which will aid this and nearby shorelines, and some of the subtidal as well, where broken pieces of this have been depositing. So now on to the Black Abalone Restoration and Relocation Project. So black abalone are an intertidal species of abalone and are an important herbivore for some California shorelines, including these particular shorelines. They are federally listed as an endangered species, and this particular project aligns with the recovery plan identified for this species. Black abalone they're broadcast spawners, so they actually need individuals close by to allow for successful reproduction to occur. This particular project aims to transplant them from a donor population with the goal of enabling these new local populations to have reproductive success for the species at these new sites that are restored. So moving on to the Ventura County dune restorations. These dune restoration projects aim to reduce the invasive plant abundance on the dunes and to restore native plant cover on them. This leads to restored and more natural dune forms, which in turn supports rare coastal species that occur in this area. These dune restoration projects are rated among the highest of those evaluated in the draft ARB and are in Ventura County. specifically at Ormond Beach, San Buenaventura, and McGrath State Beach. The Santa Monica Bay Beach and Dune Restoration Project. This project is a beach and dune restoration, as the name implies, with the goal of restoring beaches that have been degraded by intensive mechanical grooming over very long periods of time, many, many years. This restoration has been demonstrated by a successful pilot project in Santa Monica, leading to restored beaches with increased biodiversity and function, as well as more natural topography. Native dune plants that have not existed there in decades have grown back, and a snowy plover was seen on site there as well. So here's my summary slide, and this shows the approximate locations of the proposed shoreline restoration projects that are presented in this draft DARB. And now with that, I'd like to hand it off to Dr. Matt Zafonte to talk to you about human use.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Matt Zafonte. I'm an economist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Office of Spill Prevention and Response. I was the lead for the Human Use Technical Working Group. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the human use assessment for the Refugio spill and the proposed restoration process. I will do this first by covering human uses in the context of the Refugio spill. Then I will summarize the trustee's assessment and general results. This will get us to where we are today in the process. Finally, I will provide an overview of the proposed process for restoration. So on to the first topic of human uses in the context of the Refugio spill. It's important to clarify the scope of the trustee analysis. The trustee's damage claim for human uses is for the lost public use and enjoyment of natural resources. The quantification of damages for lost use is based on the estimated lost value of that use. And lost value itself is quantified as a net value, similar to the economic concept of consumer surplus. This net value is the difference between the maximum amount an individual would be willing to pay for a human use minus the amount that individual would have actually paid for that use, for example, in gasoline, supplies, reservation fees, and other associated costs. So while lost revenue associated with the spill is an economic loss to the affected parties, revenue is different from the lost public value that we are capturing in the trustee's assessment. The trustee's human use claim focuses on the lost value above and beyond the lost expenditures that translate into losses for businesses. So when one thinks about how a spill can affect the lost use and enjoyment of natural resources, you may think of how the spill closed areas to public use. The Refugio spill caused beach and fishing closures along the Gaviota coastline. There were also area closures as far south as southern Los Angeles County. These all affect how the public uses and enjoys the coastline. Of course, it's the oil itself that's at the core of the spill. Shoreline oiling was documented at varying levels from the Santa Barbara coast, where the oil was more concentrated, to Los Angeles County, where it was less intense. Contact with oil poses health risks. This can generally affect people's decisions for how to enjoy the shoreline, even in areas that are not closed. Along with oiled shoreline come spill response activities to clean up the oil. This can also affect use and enjoyment of the shoreline, disrupt parking, and impact the public's access to desired shoreline destinations. Advisories are one way the public learns of oiling. In the Refugio spill, there were numerous warning signs posted at locations along the coast. Warnings and information were also distributed via social media and alerts. These were all a result of the spill and affect how people use and enjoy the coast. This map provides a picture of the geographic distribution of area closures and posted advisories. Area closures are marked in red on the map. These were concentrated in Santa Barbara County, where there were significant beach and recreational fishing closures. There was also a brief area closures in Santa Monica Bay and Long Beach. Posted advisories marked in yellow spanned much of the Santa Barbara and Ventura coastline. There are a range of activities covered by the human use assessment. These were characterized by both the nature of the access point, which was related to the natural organization of our data, and the type of use, which was an important determinant in placing a value on use. The first category of activity is coastal camping. This is camping near the ocean at designated campgrounds, such as Refugio State Beach or Capitan State Beach and Gaviota State Park. The second is what we called shore-based recreation, which is recreation originating from beaches and informal access points. This covered a wide range of activities and includes non-water contact activities such as sunbathing, strolling, exercising, wildlife viewing, and water contact activities such as swimming, surfing, shore-based fishing, and some non-motorized watercraft. Again, as long as the watercraft originated from beaches or other informal access points. We had a category that we called boat-based recreation. This was recreational boating and offshore use that did not originate from beaches or informal access points. These trips mostly originated from harbors and marinas and included motorboating, sailboating, non-motorized boating, and uses of the Channel Island National Park. Finally, we looked at research, education, and outreach that was disrupted at the University of California Coal Oil Point Reserve. So how did we assess lost value for human uses? We started by collecting information at the time of the spill. For example, we documented the location and timing of spill-related advisories and closures. We did systematic counts of people at recreation areas, and we contacted recreation businesses to explore the impacts to their clients. After the spill wound down, we compiled data that was routinely collected by land managers and other non-governmental organizations. This included documented vehicle counts, documented user counts, collected parking fees. We were particularly interested in data collected at daily intervals, as this allowed us to better isolate the impacts of the spill. We filled in information gaps by conducting additional data collection at the first anniversary of the spill. This included activities such as in-person interviews, additional user counts, and the daily monitoring of automatic car counters. We did this at a range of sites. Working at the same time of year as when the spill occurred helped us better examine what conditions should have been like had the spill not occurred. Finally, we had to piece all this together to get a picture of total loss. One of the main tasks was to estimate human use at sites had the spill not occurred. This is what we call our baseline use. Then we examined reductions in use due to the spill, for example, by looking at reductions in user counts or vehicle access during the spill period. This is where our daily data came in handy. Then we developed spill-specific economic models to value camping and shoreline trips in Santa Barbara and Ventura counties. We used existing studies to calculate lost value for shoreline trips in Los Angeles and boat-based recreation across the spill. And our best estimate of lost value after pulling all this together up and down the coast was approximately $4.47 million. Now, most of the quantified impacts to human uses were concentrated in Santa Barbara County, where the oiling was heaviest and the recreation closures were the longest. The blue wedges on the pie chart are all in Santa Barbara County. These represent roughly 3/4 of the lost value estimate. The remaining impacts were in Ventura and Los Angeles County. Ventura County experienced more oiling, but the oiling in Los Angeles occurred in areas that are more heavily used for recreation. This is why Los Angeles County is still a pretty sizable part of the pie. Here is a distribution of the lost value estimate by our activity categories. One of the drivers of the total lost value estimate calculation is the number of affected users or user days. Most of the affected users and resulting lost value fell in the very general non-camping shore-based recreation category. This is the area in red. The next largest category was coastal camping with lengthy closures in popular state park campgrounds like Refugio and El Capitan state beaches. Boat-based recreation and research, education, and outreach were relatively highly valued uses per user day, but there are much fewer users affected in those categories. This is why their share of total value is relatively small. So now we're at the point where we are proposing a process for restoration. The settlement allocates $3.9 million to compensate for human use injuries. The goal of compensation is to match the restoration project expenditures to the distribution of lost value that we've calculated in our assessment, both by geography and by the general activity affected to the extent feasible. To these ends, we propose distributing settlement funds in 3 directions. The largest portion is directed to California state parks to administer just over half the settlement, or $2.08 million, for projects to benefit recreation on state park property from Gaviota to El Capitan. State parks will select projects in coordination with Santa Barbara County and the Trustee Council. Most of the remaining settlement funds, or $1.79 million, would be directed to a grant program, which we're calling the South Coast Shoreline Parks and Outdoor Recreation Grant Program. Projects will be selected via a competitive grant process administered by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and overseen by the state trustees. The focus of these projects will be areas down coast of El Capitan State Beach. The plan will be to distribute a request for proposals after the damage assessment and restoration plan is finalized. Finally, less than 1% of the settlement amount, or $26,000, is directed to the University of California to fund research, education, and outreach. Projects here are to be selected by the University of California in coordination with the Trustee Council. So what are the next steps? We look forward to comments on the restoration plan, and once it's finalized, we can move forward with a process to implement restoration.
So before closing tonight's meeting, I'll briefly remind everyone how to submit comments and the next steps in the restoration planning process specific to this plan. We had lots of great questions, and there's still time to comment. You can submit your comments via our Refugio Restoration at fws.gov email or by U.S. mail at the address listed in the plan. Public comments will be accepted through June 8th, 2020. And after close of the public comment period, the Trustee Council will consider all the input received during the public comment period and then finalize the restoration plan. A summary of the comments received and the Trustee Council's responses will be included in the final restoration plan. And we'll also be posting all of our presentations today, in addition to the draft and final plans, to the CDFW website. It's wildlife.ca.gov/OSPR/NRDA/Refugio website. So in closing, I'd like to thank all of you very much for your interest and for attending today's webinar. And I'd also like to thank all of today's presenters. They did a great job. And take care, everyone. Thank you.